They think I'm just another shadow in the city, a mistake. But they don't see what I see. My name is Evan Rowe, and I'm looking at the math of their ruin. The rain was freezing. I was shivering, not just from the cold, but because I had $12 left in my pocket. Evan Rowe, that was my name, and I was about to die in this alley for nothing. 3 of them. They had knives. I felt the pulse in my eyes, a sickening, jittery rhythm. The air seemed to glitch. They weren't moving. Not quite. I could see the probability of their next steps hanging in the air like dust. I stepped left. He lunged right. I didn't think. I just followed the math. I pushed past them and ran. My head burned, my vision swimming in static, but I was out. I kept running until my lungs screamed. $12, the last of my life. I stared at the rack of scratch cards and then the numbers flickered. 2%, 14%, 98%. My eyes locked on one. I scratched. My heart wasn't pounding, just calculating. Numbers flashed, gold foil revealing the truth, $500. I walked into a dusty antique shop to trade that win for something worth more. The woman behind the counter, Tessa Way, looked at me like I was a cockroach. I wasn't here to buy junk. I pointed to a misidentified silver bowl buried under rust. I knew what it was. I could see the truth beneath the grime. Tessa sold it for cheap. She thought she was ripping off a desperate kid. She had no idea she was handing me my ticket out of the gutter. I stepped back onto the street. Then it happened. My left eye bled. A sharp, hot spike hit my temple. I stumbled, clutching the wall. It wasn't magic. It was a breakdown. Every time I looked at the odds, my brain was being rewritten. And I didn't know if I had enough time to change the world before my eyes failed me. The headache wasn't just pain, it was a pressure, like a spike driven behind my left orbit. The shop sign hung lopsided in the rain, a pathetic open light flickering against the gloom. I pushed against the door. My vision flared, a white, jagged line of percentage probabilities overlaying everything. 82%, 44%, 12%. I had to make the next one count. She didn't look up when I walked in, just kept scrubbing that platter, her brow furrowed in a permanent scowl. She looked like she'd been losing for years. I cleared my throat. She finally stopped, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed my hood, my boots, my general lack of status. My sight pulsed. Over the shelves, the numbers were dismal. 0 value, trash. But then, my eyes caught a glint under a stack of moth-eaten books. A 92% success rate. My pulse climbed. I could see the truth behind the grime. I stepped forward, reaching past the clutter. Tessa lunged, her voice sharp. "Don't touch that," she warned. "It's just scrap." I didn't listen. I pulled the platter out. It was heavy. Authentic. It wasn't scrap. It was a lost piece of 18th century work. She scoffed. "You think you're an expert? That? It's been in the shop for 5 years. 5 years of no one looking twice." I pointed to the hallmark near the rim. I didn't say it was an expert's opinion. I just said it was mine. "It's worth 10,000, I lied, knowing the truth was higher. Tessa leaned in, her eyes flicking to the mark. Silence stretched. The shop sounded hollow, like all of us in it. You whispered the date. How? She looked up, the suspicion finally bleeding into something else. Fear? Hope? I didn't care which. "If we sell it, we split it 50-50, I said. She stared at me, then at the platter. It was a gamble, but she didn't have much to lose. "Fine," she muttered. "But you show me how you found it." I kept my mouth shut. That was a variable she wasn't ready to calculate. My vision began to strobe. The percentages were getting sharper, more intrusive. I needed to leave. I pushed the platter back toward her. "I'll be back tomorrow," I said. My voice sounded thin, like someone else's. She didn't say anything, just stood there, clutching the silver. I made it to the sidewalk. My vision was blurring at the edges, a gray haze swallowing the street lamps. I gripped the brick wall, trying to breathe. The math was still there, but it was getting expensive. Every calculation was stealing another piece of my eyesight. I was running out of time. I needed water. I needed rest. But the shop bell rang behind me, a sharp, melodic sound that cut through my panic. I turned back. A man was walking inside. He looked like he owned the street, his coat cut from cloth that cost more than this whole block. He didn't look at the shelves. He looked at the floor like he was afraid of touching the dust. "You really hold on to this junk," he sneered. Tessa didn't move. She just took it. That was the game. You smile, you bow, and you hope they don't buy out your building to make a parking lot. He turned, spotting the platter. "That piece," he spat the words, "is a common fake. Don't waste people's time." He was lying. My sight spiked to 98% certainty. He knew exactly what it was, and he wanted it for nothing. I felt my hand drift toward the door handle. The gala smelled like expensive perfume and old, rotting lies. That Tessa looked uncomfortable in her borrowed dress. I was worse. The hoodie felt like an anchor in this sea of tuxedos. Then I saw him. Vincent Halloway. He wasn't just standing there, he owned the air around him. He was selling dreams. And I knew the price of his currency, total ruin. I approached the centerpiece. An oil painting, 17th century, supposedly. My vision flickered. Numbers swirled into my peripheral. A sickening gray glitch. Authenticity rate 4%. It wasn't an antique. It was a recent print, aged with chemicals. My skull pulsed. A needle-sharp headache reminded me that the truth always costs something. A man in a custom silk suit reached for his bidding paddle. I didn't think. I just spoke. I told him to look at the bottom left corner. The brushwork didn't match the period pigment. The auctioneer hissed at me, demanding I leave. He looked like he'd swallowed a wasp. I didn't budge. I held the bidder's gaze. And he dropped his paddle. He heard me. I felt a weight pressing down on me. I looked up. Holloway was still there. He wasn't angry. He was observing. The way a scientist observes a new bacteria, an assistant, slick as a snake, slid an envelope into my hand, ivory cardstock. Heavy. A name was on it, Evan Rowe. The handwriting was perfect, and it terrified me. Tessa looked at the invite. Her eyes went wide. She knew exactly whose office this meant. It was an invitation to the center of the trap. Holloway wanted to see me. Was I afraid? No. Not anymore. I just felt the weight of the odds. 98%. That was the probability of me not coming back from that meeting? The city rain hit my face. It felt cleaner than the air inside. I tucked the invitation into my pocket. My eye was burning again, a constant reminder. I put the invite on the counter. It was a target. Holloway was already waiting. And tomorrow, I was going to walk right into his den. The brass handle was ice cold. My palm burned. I pushed. The office was vast, sterile, and smelled like expensive leather and old money. But Holloway wasn't there. Only a man in a turtleneck, smirking like he owned the floor. He told me Vincent was busy. A lie. I saw the probability ticker above his head flickering, 12% success. He was stalling. He was testing me. And the vase sitting on the velvet pedestal between us? It was the bait. The vase was exquisite. Cobalt glaze, Ming Dynasty styling. Rourke wanted a verdict. If I called it authentic, I was a fool. If I called it fake, I was an amateur without sophistication. He was fishing for a trap. I didn't reach for it. I didn't even lean in. I just pointed at the base. The firing line was too perfect. Machine made. It's a reproduction, I said. Rourke stopped tapping the pen. The room went silent. He hadn't expected me to spot the kiln mark. He tried to laugh it off, but his eyes betrayed him. He was calculating the cost of this failure. I had won the first round. The commission was mine, whether he liked it or not. My vision blurred. A pulse throbbed behind my left eye. The room started to tilt, just for a second. I forced myself to breathe. If I collapsed now, the game was over. I wasn't just tired, I was burning out. Rourke stood up, his face an oily mask of forced professional courtesy. He handed me the contract, a piece of paper that was my ticket into the inner circle. But as he turned to retrieve his briefcase, he left his desk open, unlocked. I saw the edge of a folder sticking out. A ledger. I shouldn't have looked. It was reckless. But the chance was there, sitting at 99% probability of revealing something critical. I didn't hesitate. My fingers pulled the page free. A list of transactions, names I recognized. Amounts that didn't belong in an antique ledger. Money laundering? Holloway wasn't just a curator. He was a gatekeeper for the city's worst secrets. I folded it, shoved it into my pocket, and stood up straight. My pulse was a war drum, but I kept my face as blank as a tombstone. Rourke turned around, his smug grin still plastered on, blissfully unaware. I shook his hand. It was soft, weak. I'll send the appraisal report by morning, I told him. He thanked me like he was hiring a servant. He had no idea I'd just pocketed the evidence that would destroy his life. I stepped out into the hallway. The air was colder here. I didn't run, I walked. My vision was swimming in shades of gray, but the ledger page was warm against my thigh. This wasn't just a game anymore. My pulse was a drum in my ears. The paper in my hand felt heavier than paper should. It was a fragment of the network I'd suspected for weeks. I didn't wait. I turned, and the office door was just a silhouette against the sterile glow of the hallway. A shadow detached itself from the elevator bank. One of Rourke's men. He hadn't seen me yet, but the percentage above his head was hovering at 82%. He was looking for something. Or someone. I needed to move. My vision flickered, the numbers bleeding into the real world. A service stairwell was behind the maintenance door. The odds of making it without being spotted? 64%. Better than standing here, waiting to be found. The door clicked shut. I didn't look back. I listened, footsteps hitting the carpet, frantic and heavy. Agesses. They were getting closer. I took the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the protest of my lungs. The ground floor exit opened to the alley. Cold air hit me like a slap. I could see the security team spilling out from the lobby entrance. They'd realized the mistake. I vanished into the shadows, merging with the city's concrete decay. The antique shop was a sanctuary of dust and broken things. I pushed the door open, the bell ringing out with a lonely, tinny sound. Tessa was at the back, her hands busy with some brass hardware. I slid the paper across the counter. My hand was shaking. She stared at it for a long beat, her eyes widening as the numbers and names registered. It wasn't just a list. It was a blueprint for a clean getaway. She whispered that this wasn't just money laundering. It was a loop. They were buying their own art, inflating the value, and then donating it back to themselves through charities. A perfect, circular drain of the city's wealth. My vision started to swim. The numbers began to blur, turning into long, sharp needles that felt like they were piercing my skull. I tried to focus on the page, but everything went sideways. A dark crimson stain started to pool in the corner of my eye. Tessa reached for me, her face pale. She was saying something. I heard her voice, but it sounded like it was underwater. The cost was too high. I needed to see the next move, just one more calculation. But my brain was screaming, and the room was folding in on itself. Everything was just a chaotic, bleeding mess of probability. The floor came up to meet me. The last thing I heard was the bell on the door ringing, a reminder that the world was still turning, even as mine stopped. I had the ledger, but I was losing myself. My vision felt like broken glass. I woke up on the backroom floor, Tessa's hand against my forehead. The shop felt wrong. The air was cold, and on the wooden desk sat a thick, cream-colored envelope with the Holloway crest embossed in black. I didn't need to open the envelope. The probability of eviction was sitting at 99%. Holloway wasn't just coming for me. He was tearing the floor out from under my only friend. Tessa was already gathering her things. She said the landlord had sold the building to a shell corporation managed by Holloway's firm. 2 weeks. That's what we had before they changed the locks. I looked at the ledger fragment again. Rourke had left breadcrumbs leading straight to Holloway's real estate laundering schemes. The law favored the landlord, but the truth? The truth was worth more than the building. I tracked the Shell Corporation's legal representative to the city planning gala. They were shaking hands, drinking champagne, celebrating the redevelopment of the district. I didn't wait for an invite. I walked through the doors with the ledger in my pocket. I approached Holloway's lead attorney near the buffet. He saw my clothes and sneered. He asked if I was lost. I just handed him a copy of the ledger. I told him he should read it before he made a speech about community improvement. The lawyer's color drained away. He didn't say a word. He just started walking towards the exit, his cell phone pressed to his ear. The Shell Court's public relations nightmare had just started, and I was the one who pulled the trigger. I didn't stay for the aftermath. The headache was returning, a thrumming beat in my skull. I made it back to the shop just as the lights were flickering off. Tessa looked up, saw me, and stopped scrubbing. She knew. She saw the shiver in my hands and didn't ask about the gala. She just pulled out a chair and told me to sit. "We bought some time," she whispered. "That's all that matters." The shop bell rang, a sharp, grating sound that felt like ice picks in my ears. I looked up. It wasn't an evicted landlord. It was a man in a trench coat, his eyes scanning the shop with practiced, lethal precision. Detective Knox. He didn't look at the shelves, he looked at me. He walked right to the counter, pulled out a photograph of the gala, and pointed to the blurry figure in the background. Me. He told me he'd been tracking the disturbances at every auction I attended. He said my luck was becoming a very loud statistic. He looked me in the eye and asked me where I was on the night the ledger went missing. I felt my vision start to jitter, a flicker of 0%. The damp cold clung to his trench coat. Knox stood by the entrance, his presence filling the cramped space. He wasn't looking at the inventory, he was measuring me. Every movement of his head was deliberate, like a predator scanning for a weakness. He asked about the auction again, not the items, but the timing. He wanted to know how a nobody like me happened to be standing in the right place when the forgery fell apart. I kept my breathing steady. Any spike in my pulse and the percentage might fluctuate. I glanced at his badge. A faint, glowing 64% hovered over it. The probability he was actually looking for a lead rather than just a target to hassle. He was frustrated. That gave me a lever. Tessa stepped out from the shadows near the back room. She didn't say a word, just moved to stand beside me, her arms crossed. Her presence shifted the dynamics. Now, we were a wall. He didn't like being outnumbered. He scoffed, dropping his notepad onto the counter. The sound was too loud in the quiet shop. He asked if I honestly thought a coincidence of that magnitude was believable. I didn't blink. I just played the part of the confused amateur. I asked him why. He wasn't asking Dominic Rourke the same questions. I mentioned the appraisal discrepancies I'd seen. The bait was set. It was the truth, but packaged in a way that made him feel like he dug it up himself. Knox paused. The name hit home. He knew Rourke, but he clearly hadn't considered him a primary target yet. I saw his eyebrows knit together, a small shift in the math. His focus moved from my history to Rourke's present. My vision began to strobe. White noise blurred the edges of the room. I had to focus on the numbers flickering over Knox's shoulder to keep from fainting. If I dropped now, it was all over. I gripped the counter until my knuckles went white. He picked up his notepad. He didn't thank me, and he didn't apologize for the intrusion. He just gave me a look that said the case wasn't closed. It was just changing shape. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely bypassed the shop's silence. "Stay out of Holloway's way, Ro. Some games aren't meant for people like you to play. Next time, I won't be checking your scratch tickets." He walked out. The bell above the door didn't make a sound. I watched him cross the street and climb into his cruiser. The engine turned over, a dull roar that seemed to echo inside my own skull. Tessa let out a breath she'd been holding since he walked in. She looked at me, waiting for a breakdown, but I just leaned back against the counter. I'd won the round, but the cost was showing. I could feel my vision beginning to cloud again. Knox's footsteps died away. The shop felt colder, the dust motes hanging in the stale air like lead weights. Tessa was staring at the front door, her hand still gripping her apron. She knew, and I knew, we were playing a game where the board was rigged against us. I opened the laptop we'd salvaged. Holloway's firewall wasn't just a gate, it was a fortress of rotating sub-protocols. Every path I plotted to bypass it spiked my ocular strain to critical. I looked at Tessa, the numbers blurring into a gray haze. We needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Tessa didn't hesitate, she grabbed her keys. She told me she knew someone, a ghost in the digital backstreets who owed her a favor for a stack of rare 1980s mainframe manuals. It was a long shot, but at this point, every option felt like a gamble. Found Samira in a windowless room buried under half-disassembled hardware. She didn't look up when the door groaned open. She just kept typing, her screen a wall of cascading code. When she finally turned, her gaze was like a laser, dissecting us before we could even introduce ourselves. I showed her the encryption fragment. She scoffed, calling it amateur architecture. She told me that if I didn't understand the underlying node structure, I was just spinning my wheels. She basically told us to leave, but I saw the bottleneck in her own build, a redundant packet loop she hadn't noticed. I explained the logic. The probability of that loop crashing her server in 6 hours was 94%. Her jaw tightened, then loosened. She checked the logs, her fingers dancing. The surprise on her face was almost as satisfying as the win itself. She finally looked at me like I wasn't just another waste of time. She swiveled her chair around. She told me she could crack Holloway's firewall, but it would take everything her system had. She looked me in the eyes, really looked, and asked why I was pushing so hard. I didn't answer. I just told her to start the trace. My vision flickered. Percentages flared and died like dying stars across her monitors. 42%, 18%, 0.5%. The headache rolled behind my eyes, a dull pulse that grew sharp with every command she keyed in. Tessa put a hand on my shoulder. She knew. I just focused on the screen. A final progress bar crawled across the screen. 99%. 100%. A directory tree opened. It was massive. Holloway's entire offshore laundering operations. Then, a single, protected file flashed in red. Project 12. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was it. I leaned in. The numbers didn't just indicate money. The success rate for this project had a 99% probability of total social erasure. Samira whispered that it wasn't just a file, it was an active kill switch for Holloway's political rivals. Samira turned to us. She looked at my shaky hands, my unfocused eyes. She didn't ask questions. She just asked how many hands we needed to keep this folder from being wiped. Tessa grabbed my hand, squeezing it until my knuckles ached. We were in this together. Outside, the city lights shimmered like gold coins, oblivious to the fact that Holloway's foundation was about to crack. I sat back, the weight of Project 12 pressing down on me. I didn't know what was inside, but I knew who held the match, and I was going to light it. The terminal window pulsed. Millions of lines of encrypted code. I didn't see text anymore. I saw percentages. 12%, 44%, 89%. Every digit was a drain on my nerves, a cold needle pricking at my brain. I leaned in, my reflection ghostly in the glass. Samira sat nearby, her face pale in the white of her own monitor. She whispered that the firewall was shifting, constantly adapting to my pokes. She didn't understand that I wasn't just poking the wall. I was looking for the crack in the foundation. My vision began to strobe. The percentages on the screen were turning red. 99%, 99.1%, 99.5%. It was close. I just needed one final surge to bypass the final security layer of Project 12. I didn't care about the throbbing behind my eyes anymore. I felt something warm leak from my right eye. It blurred the edge of the screen, creating a crimson smear across the code. I ignored it. I was so close. The server directory was opening, the folders appearing one by one. Project 12. It wasn't just one file, it was a list of names, a list of accounts tied to city council members, judges, and the very foundation of the elite art trade. I reached for the export button, my fingers trembling. The pain hit like a sledgehammer. My brain wasn't just processing, it was burning. The screen went white, then black, then white again. I fell forward, my head striking the desk with a dull thud. I heard a scream. It was distant, like it was coming from underwater. Tessa. She was running, her boots pounding the floorboards of the shop. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew something had gone wrong. Tessa stood frozen in the doorway. Samira was already by my side, her hands shaking as she tried to peel back my eyelid. There was too much blood. Tessa's hands covered her mouth. She hadn't expected this price. Samira looked up at Tessa. She told her it wasn't a stroke. She'd seen the readout. She told her my brain had been overloaded by the data, that I had literally pushed my synapses to melt. Hours later, the room was cold. I opened my eyes. Everything was a gray smudge. I tried to focus, but the percentages were gone. There was only a thin, hazy static dancing in my field of view. Tessa sat in the chair next to me. She told me I'd been out for 6 hours. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with a cold, hard anger. She asked if it was worth it. I didn't have an answer. I blinked, and for a second, my sight flickered back. I looked at the wall. A small number hovered over the door, 5s. I looked at the floor, 3. I looked at the glass of water, 1. I knew what it meant. My calculations were running out. My eyes wouldn't resolve. The room was a mess of gray shapes and shifting light. I blinked, hoping to clear the haze, but the shadows only deepened. The cost of Project 12 wasn't just data, it was my ability to see the world at all. Tessa leaned over, her face a blur of concern I couldn't fully parse. She reached out, placing a cold towel against my forehead. The touch was grounding, a stark contrast to the terrifying static of my own mind. She told me to stay down, her tone leaving no room for argument. Samira stood in the corner, her fingers tapping against her laptop. She looked at me, her eyes narrow. She relayed the news. Holloway's server was prepped for the auction. It was the only window we'd get. If I didn't push now, the evidence would be deleted forever. I grabbed the keyboard, my hands shaking. I needed to see the structure of their security protocols one last time. Percentages flashed in the dark. 4% success, 12% success, 89% failure. The numbers were dying, just like my sight. But the gap in his firewall was a clear 92%. I uploaded the payload. It was a digital ghost, a file that would overwrite Holloway's provenance claims with pure, verifiable fact. My vision flickered, turning white for a heartbeat. I had 5% left, maybe less. I was running on nothing. Across the city, Vincent Holloway adjusted his cufflinks. He stood before the vanity mirror in his private suite. He knew nothing of the digital rot eating away at his empire. He looked at his reflection, admiring the man who owned the art world. Dominic Rourke paced the room, biting his nail. He whispered to Holloway about the security anomalies. Holloway cut him off with a gesture of his hand. He wasn't interested in ghost stories. He was interested in the money coming in tonight. I collapsed onto the floor, my eyes throbbing. Tessa was there instantly, her face pale. I couldn't see her features anymore, just the shape of her worry. I told her it was done. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for the fallout. The gala hall was a cathedral of greed. Chandeliers hung like frozen stars. Guests filed in, their clothes worth more than the block I grew up on. I wasn't there, but I saw it all through Samira's network. Holloway walked to the podium, beaming. Samira opened the link. I could see the live stream. The provenance data for the lead painting, a fake Holloway had pushed for years, was being overwritten by the real history. It was changing right under the eyes of the bidders. His masterpiece was becoming his confession. Holloway tapped the microphone. The room went silent. He leaned in, ready to claim the evening's biggest prize. He had no clue that the screens behind him were already displaying the truth. The auction was about to become an execution. Then, the flicker. The data loaded. The screen behind him jumped from the fake painting to the scanned ledger pages I'd leaked. The crowd gasped in unison. Holloway turned, his face losing its color. It was done. The empire was bleeding. I pushed the final key. The injection script hit the auction network. I watched the screen, waiting for the provenance records to flip, but the numbers didn't change. Above the auctioneer's head, a flicker caught my eye. The probability calculation. It wasn't shifting. It was stuck. 0. The percentage stared back at me, a digit of absolute failure. I tried to look at the room, at the people in their silk ties, trying to find an exit, but the glitching numbers were gray and static. My sight was dying, and the data stream, it was bait. Vincent Holloway stepped into the spotlight. He didn't look like a man whose empire was crashing. He looked like a man delivering a keynote address. He gestured to the big screen behind him, where my own code was currently being broadcasted to the entire room. He smiled. He told the room he detected an amateur intrusion, a systematic fraud attempt by a competitor. He didn't say my name, but he didn't have to. The security team didn't look at the screen. They looked at the wings where I was standing. The trap was sprung, and I was inside it. I grabbed my gear. Samira's voice crackled through the earpiece. It was frantic, clipped, and then it cut out entirely. A rhythmic thud hit the door of our shop. They weren't just here at the gala, they were everywhere. Tessa slammed the shop's heavy front door. She didn't look at me, she looked at the window. The reflection of blue and red strobes was already dancing across her face. We were out of moves. Detective Notch was the one who kicked it in. He looked tired. He looked like he'd been waiting for this exact moment for months. He didn't even draw his weapon, he just stepped over the threshold, his badge hanging heavy against his coat. My brain felt like it was splitting. The ocular strain was beyond anything I'd ever recorded. I tried to calculate an escape, but the numbers wouldn't form. They were just static now. Gray, static, empty. Security for the gala poured out into the back lot. They weren't looking for me. They were looking for the criminals Holloway had identified. Their flashlights crisscrossed the rain. I held my breath, huddled in the gap between the trash bins as the light passed right over my boots. I waited until the last heavy footfall receded. I pulled myself up. My legs felt like lead. The city didn't care about my math. The city didn't care about my talent. It was just a game of numbers I had finally lost. I reached the bridge. Sirens. They were everywhere now. Behind me, the city glowed with the wealth I'd tried to steal back. In front of me, nothing. My vision was failing entirely. The world was just a smudge of light. I closed my eyes. The static cleared for a second, just enough for me to see the end of it all. I had 12 to my name when this started, and that's exactly where I was headed back to. 0. The siren cut through the rain like a razor. I didn't look back. My vision was a jagged mess of gray noise, but I saw the red path. It was the only way through. If I missed this alley, I was finished. Holloway was probably sipping scotch, watching the reports. He thought I was just a beggar with a dream. He didn't know I still had the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. The drive in my pocket burned like coal. A black sedan crawled past the intersection. Holloway's dogs. I stayed behind the dumpster. My eyes flickered. The path overlay hit 12%. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was just trying to survive until morning. I found the basement. The door was wedged tight, but Tessa was there. She didn't say a word. She just pulled me inside, her face set in that hard, jagged line that told me everything I didn't want to hear. The shop was gone, everything. She hadn't even grabbed the ledger. I dropped to the floor, my legs giving out. We were ghosts now. No money, no shop, no network, just a room that smelled of mildew. I reached into my pocket. My hands were shaking, but I pulled it out. A small, black drive. It was light as a feather, yet it held the weight of Holloway's entire empire. Tessa stared at it like it was a live grenade. She whispered that we couldn't even plug it in. Our computers were back at the shop. The police had the perimeter locked down. I told her it didn't matter. We just needed a way to read the data. My eyes were failing. Every time I tried to visualize the decryption, the static worsened. I was running on nothing but pure adrenaline and the spite that Holloway had left me with. I forced a look at the drive. The probability overlay flickered into existence, but the numbers were all wrong. They weren't percentages. They were layered recursive codes that I couldn't even begin to calculate. I realized then, this wasn't just a ledger, it was a digital maze. Without Samira's architecture, we were going to be dead before we even opened the first door. Somewhere out there, Holloway was moving. I could feel the probability of our discovery increasing by the second. We were running out of time, out of luck, and out of sight. I looked at the drive again. The complexity was higher than anything I'd ever seen. Samira couldn't crack this. Nobody could. We were holding the most valuable secret in the city, and it might as well have been a rock. The drive sat on the crate like a tombstone. Tessa typed until her knuckles turned white, but the firewall remained a solid wall of nothing. It wasn't just encryption. It was a digital lock meant to break anyone who touched it. Tessa slammed the phone down. She told me the lead attorney at Holloway's firm had laughed while he read their list of injunctions. Not just a lawsuit, a complete legal blackout. They'd frozen every asset she'd ever touched. I didn't argue, I just looked at the drive. I told her the law was a game built for people like Holloway. If we played by their rules, we'd lose before the first motion was filed. I remembered Samuel Beck. He wasn't a hero and he wasn't kind. But he hated Holloway with a burning personal obsession. If I could get to him, I wouldn't need a lawyer. I would need a wrecking ball. I told Tessa to stay put. If they came looking, she needed to vanish into the sewers if she had to. She didn't like it. She said the plan was suicide, but she didn't try to stop me. The glittering district felt like another planet. I felt like a ghost walking through glass cathedrals. My vision flickered, spasms of white light making the percentage readouts dance over every expensive facade. My skull felt like it was splitting. Every step toward Beck's estate forced my eyes to work. The probability percentages were screaming at me now, most options at 0. 0 chance of survival, 0 chance of making it to the gate. I reached the gate. It was wrought iron, ancient, and high enough to keep out a small army. I didn't ring the bell. I just leaned against the cold metal, waiting for someone to notice the man who wasn't supposed to exist. The intercom buzzed. A voice, bored and rich, told me to leave. I didn't move. I told the box my name. I told them I had something that would make Vincent Holloway's entire legacy burn to the ground. There was a long silence. The lock clicked, a heavy mechanical sound that echoed in the dark. The gate groaned open, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I knew the moment I stepped inside, there was no going back. I walked up the path, my breath hitching in my chest. I checked the probability again. It was low, but it wasn't zero. That was the only thing I needed to hear. I finally reached the front door. I stood there, battered, broken, and desperate. I pressed the buzzer one last time. As Samuel Beck wanted to show he was about to get the performance of a lifetime. The ornate gates of Beck's estate groaned as they swung open. I didn't wait for an invite. The security guards had their hands on their holsters, but I walked right past them, eyes fixed on the heavy mahogany door of the study. Samuel Beck sat behind an antique desk, a magnifying glass in his hand. He looked up, his brow furrowed. He asked what a starving ghost like me thought he was doing in his study. I didn't answer. I just pointed at the floor. I told him the perimeter alarm he'd installed was useless, because someone had already bypassed the West Wing motion sensor 3 minutes ago. I saw the 0% success rate on his current security system flicker above his head. He looked at me, then at the monitor on his wall. Beck scrambled to hit the silent alert button. He finally looked at me like I wasn't just another street rat. He asked how I knew. I didn't explain the math. I just said I saw the cracks in the armor everyone else ignored. Beck didn't call the police. He stood up, adjusted his smoking jacket, and pulled a heavy drape away from a hidden painting. He told me if I was as good as I claimed, I'd tell him why Holloway's associates were so desperate for this specific piece. I stepped closer. My eyes began to burn. The probability numbers danced over the frame. 99% fake, 1% nightmare. The light in the room seemed to bend as I tried to force my brain to interpret the brushwork. It was a masterpiece, all right. A masterpiece of deception. I blinked, and the air around the painting turned into a sea of red static. The numbers weren't just indicating value, they were showing origins. This painting had never touched the artist's hand. It was a marker, a beacon Holloway used to track illicit assets across borders. My nose started bleeding. I wiped it away with the back of my hand, not caring about the blood on my sleeve. I turned to Beck. He was watching me with that same cold look I saw in the mirror every morning. I told him the truth. It wasn't art, it was a signal. Holloway was using this forgery to guide his shipments, and anyone who held the painting was a walking target for his recovery teams. Beck turned pale. He realized he wasn't just a collector anymore. He was a co-conspirator. Beck offered me a glass of scotch. He said we had a mutual problem. If Holloway found out about his involvement, he was ruined. If I walked away, I was dead. He asked me how much I needed to make Holloway's markers disappear. I didn't care about the money. I needed access. Access to the network that moved these pieces. I grabbed the glass, the liquid burning all the way down. The deal was done. Holloway thought he was hunting a ghost, but he was about to realize he was being tracked by his own equipment. I looked out the window. The lights of the estate were bright, but I knew what was hiding in the shadows. Holloway was already checking his signal, and he was going to find out real fast that his marker was no longer in the hands of a fool. My hands were shaking. I adjusted the bow tie, the fabric biting into my throat. The migraine hummed behind my eyes, a low, rhythmic pulse of impending dark. I wasn't just a guest, I was a ghost. And ghosts don't get second chances. The gala entrance was a gauntlet. Security scanned every face, every bag, every intent. I stepped forward. Numbers floated over the guard's shoulder. 82% chance they'd blink if I looked to the left. I looked left. They waved me through without a word. Inside, it was a different world. Gold leaf, expensive cologne, and the smell of ancient money. Holloway stood in the center, surrounded by sycophants. He looked exactly like the man who ruined me. Smug, immaculate, and completely exposed. I navigated the room. My sight flickered, numbers dancing over guests like price tags. 90% success on the path through the fountain, 75 on the detour by the buffet. I followed the math. I was a predator in a uniform. I reached him. He didn't even look at me. He just held out his glass, a gesture for a refill. "You're late, boy," he muttered, not breaking conversation. My name wasn't on his radar. To him, I was just furniture. I swapped the glass for a fresh one. My fingers brushed the inside of his jacket. The tracker was small, no bigger than a coin. I slipped it into the silk lining. He didn't flinch. I had him. Then the world tilted. The percentage numbers over the guests' heads began to bleed. They dissolved into a frantic, digital gray static. The migraine hit, a sledgehammer to the base of my skull. I couldn't see my own feet, total darkness. I wasn't at the gala anymore. I was inside my own burning brain. I couldn't navigate by light, so I relied on the cold air coming from the side exit. 1 step. 2. If I collapsed here, I was a dead man. I hit the brick of the alleyway and gasped. Cold rain, real air, real air. I leaned back, letting the darkness consume me for a second, just one, before the survival instinct kicked back in. I reached into my pocket. The signal was live. I stared at the map. It wasn't the gallery. It wasn't his office. The dot blinked, a steady rhythmic pulse coming from an industrial zone miles away. It was a bunker. Something he wanted buried deep, something worth more than his whole life's work. My vision began to clear, just enough to see the address. It was fortified, guarded, and sitting in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't just tracking a man anymore. I was walking straight into his tomb. Or maybe mine. The monitor flickered. The tracker signal didn't settle in a gallery or a loft. It was buried in the industrial wasteland, a concrete slab on the city's edge. I felt the pulse of the signal in my own skull, rhythmic, cold, and entirely shielded. Samira zoomed in. That bunker wasn't just storage, it was a vault. Holloway wouldn't keep his best frauds in the light. They were kept in the dark, rotting in a climate-controlled grave. I had to get inside that bunker before the trail went cold. To open the door, I needed a key, not a physical one. I needed a name. Dominic Rourke had been sweating since the gala. He was the broker. He knew where the ghosts were buried. I just had to make him believe I was the one who could resurrect them. Dominic walked in, eyes scanning for a mark. He looked like he'd lost sleep. Good. Fear made people talk. He pulled out a chair, his smile thin and brittle. He was looking for an investor, but he found something else entirely. My vision flickered. Percentages danced across Dominic's forehead, an 84% probability he'd bite if I offered enough. The strain hit my optic nerves like a needle. I had to finish this before I hit 0. I pushed a burner phone across the table. I told him I had capital that didn't like the light. His eyes lit up. He didn't care where the money came from, just that it was big. He took the bait. He told me he could move anything. He claimed to have access to assets that would make an auctioneer weep. I pressed him. I mentioned the ghost paintings. The air in the booth shifted. Dominic froze. Hiche you nebu. Dominic leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. He admitted it. The bunker held the real inventory. The originals used to forge the provenance. He thought he was impressing me. He didn't know he was writing his own confession. I stood up. I'd heard enough. The vault wasn't just a warehouse, it was the entire foundation of Holloway's lie. Every painting, every ledger, every history he'd rewritten, it was all there. I looked at Dominic one last time. He had no idea what I was going to do. The moment I stepped onto the street, my legs gave way. My vision went black for 3 seconds. A total, absolute void. I leaned against a brick wall, gasping. I was running on nothing. The bunker was the target, but I wasn't sure if I could even survive the walk there. Back at the shop, the full architectural map of the vault appeared on Samira's screen. It was impenetrable. Laser arrays, pressure-sensitive floors, biometric locks that required dual-key decryption. We were just 2 people with a laptop. I needed a miracle or a lot more power. Samira looked at me. Her expression said everything. The hardware we had couldn't touch this. We needed a digital override that existed only in the highest levels of the city's network. And I didn't have the time to build one. I was out of time. I didn't hand the drive to him personally. That would be suicide. I sent it through a secure server, the digital breadcrumbs leading straight from Rourke's mouth to Knox's private terminal. I watched the status update from the back room of the shop. File received. The timer started. Knox was sitting at his desk. I wasn't there, but I knew the look. He'd be staring at the audio file, the ambient noise of the station humming around him. His captain was pacing behind him, demanding he bury the report on the Holloway case. It was a 12% success rate for him to keep that job if he listened to it. He listened anyway. I heard it later from the way he gripped his steering wheel in the precinct parking lot. He didn't turn it in. He put his coat on, walked out past the captain, and drove toward the park. He knew I was the one who sent it. He just didn't know why. I felt the headache long before I saw him. My vision was swimming, the world bleeding into shades of static. I sat on a bench, the cold air biting at my skin. Then he appeared. He didn't look like an ally. He looked like a man with a target in his sights. He told me the recording was a fabrication until he checked the metadata. I watched his face. He was weighing the risks. I held my breath, letting the probability percentages flicker over him. 82% chance he'd arrest me, 18% chance he'd listen. I leaned into the 18. I asked him if he wanted the career or the criminal. I didn't say Holloway by name. I just pointed at the weight on his shoulders. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the trees, then back at me. The percentage over his head spiked to 45%. I was gaining ground. The headache surged, a white-hot needle behind my eyes. I gripped the wooden slats of the bench until my knuckles turned white. Knox didn't notice. He was already talking about the precinct, about the closed doors. He was tired of losing. He sat down. Right there, next to me. The space between us was no longer a cage, it was a trench. He asked me what I needed. I told him I needed eyes inside the facility. He looked at his hands, then at his watch. He said the facility was a black hole for police reports. He'd been trying to get a warrant for months, and every time his captain killed it. Then he looked at me. His eyes were cold, professional. He told me the real issue wasn't the paintings, it was what they were doing to them. I asked him what he meant. He said Holloway was moving assets. He'd received a notification from a source in the logistics firm. Not just any logistics, Holloway's private movers. They had a manifest for a complete sweep. I asked him when. He told me the date, 24 hours, they were scrubbing the facility clean. By tomorrow night, it would be empty. No ghost paintings, no evidence, no leverage against Holloway. He closed the notebook and stood up. The wind caught his trench coat, fluttering it around his legs. He looked at me, a final look. I knew then he was in. He told me to get ready, because once they were inside, there was no going back. The perimeter of the storage facility was quiet. Too quiet. I could hear Samira's shallow breathing beside me. Knox had cleared the patrol routes, but we were working on a deadline that measured time and pulses of blood against my eardrums. Samira connected her interface directly to the external junction box. Her fingers danced over the keys, each tap a sharp snap in the stillness. She was fighting a proprietary encryption I'd seen only in Holloway's private financial software. She whispered that the digital handshake was accepted. A green light flickered on the keypad, but the final lock, the biometric override, wasn't digital. It was a shifting sequence of biometric signatures that changed every 3 seconds. I pushed past her. The percentages flooded my vision, a sea of flickering static. I had to calculate the next sequence based on the system's erratic internal clock. If I guessed wrong, the alarm would trigger in 10 milliseconds. My vision began to strobe, not the percentages, my own sight. The world was tearing at the edges. I saw the sequence, 7924. I reached for the keypad, my fingers feeling like they belonged to someone else. The lock clicked. A heavy magnetic thud echoed through the alley. We were in. I felt a surge of triumph, but it was quickly drowned out by the scream of a migraine splitting my skull in two. I didn't hear the door open. I just hit the ground. My knees buckled, and my hands went to my face. The world was nothing but black, pulsating spots of light. I couldn't see Samira. I couldn't see the vault. Tessa was there instantly, pulling me back from the threshold. She didn't panic. She just looked at my face, saw the blood, and turned her head to give the order. She was taking charge now. I heard her voice, sharp and steady. She told Samira to stay with me and prep the emergency kit. She wasn't asking for my permission. She was doing what had to be done to finish the job. From the distance, Knox gave a signal. A flash of a flashlight in the alley meant the perimeter was secured. We were clear, but the cost of that clarity was currently pooling against my eyelids. Samira tried to wipe the blood from my eyes, her hands trembling. She wasn't looking at the screens anymore. She was looking at the price. I tried to tell her it didn't matter, but my voice wouldn't come out. Tessa disappeared into the darkness of the vault. I could hear her footsteps, careful and silent. She was going to recover the ghost paintings. I wanted to help, but I couldn't even lift my hand. The vault door creaked as it settled. I was outside, useless. Tessa was inside, in the belly of the beast. And somewhere, out there in the city, Holloway was moving. I'd given everything for this moment. The vault door groaned. Tessa's shadow cut across the floor, stretching over my face. I couldn't see the percentages anymore, just white static bleeding into the edges of my vision. I reached out, my fingers scraping the cold concrete. Tessa knelt beside me, her palm cool against my forehead. She didn't ask how I felt. She didn't need to. She just reached down and pulled the heavy black ledger from the shelf behind her. It was heavy, wrapped in reinforced plastic. She had it. Samira's voice crackled through the earbud, thin, sharp, terrified. The perimeter sensors had tripped. 3 guards were closing in. They weren't just patrolling, they were running. The purge had started ahead of schedule. Tessa didn't hesitate. She dragged me up, hooking my arm over her shoulder. Her face was set like stone. We didn't have a plan anymore, we just had the exit. Every step she took was measured, precise, like she'd been doing this for years. Voices echoed off the concrete. The guards were closer than Samira predicted. I could hear their boots thumping against the floorboards. Tessa pushed me behind a row of wooden crates and held a finger to her lips. She wasn't shaking, not at all. The guard's voice rumbled, hollow and bored. He complained about the shift. He didn't know he was guarding the biggest fraud in the city's history. He kicked a bin, the sound reverberating like a gunshot through the silence of the warehouse. As they turned the corner, Tessa didn't wait. She moved with a calculated silence I hadn't known she possessed. She guided us toward the service elevator. I felt the pulse in my skull. If we reached the lobby, we were out. 84% chance of success. The doors slid open. Inside, a cart sat abandoned with half-packed files. We slipped in just as the elevator pinged. Samira sent a code that overridden the floor sensors. We weren't just leaving, we were erasing our footprints. The air in the lobby was cool, stale, and metallic. We hit the parking ramp, and for the first time in hours, my eyes cleared. The percentages came back, flickering over the parked sedans. We'd done it. We had the evidence. Tessa shoved me into the passenger seat and threw the ledger into the footwell. She didn't celebrate. She just started the engine, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "Stay awake, Evan," she muttered. We aren't home yet. Back in the safe house, the silence was heavy. I cracked open the ledger. I expected Holloway's names, his bank accounts, his ghosts. Instead, I saw a map of names I didn't recognize. And the numbers. Millions. Billions. All flowing to one account. I looked up at Tessa. The ledger didn't prove Holloway was the architect of this fraud, it proved he was the gatekeeper. We hadn't just stolen evidence, we'd poked a hornet's nest that was far, far bigger than the man himself. I turned the page, expecting numbers that would dismantle Holloway. Instead, the ink seemed to shift. A string of code, glowing faint blue beneath my heady eyes. It wasn't accounting, it was a broadcast signal waiting for a connection. Samira stopped typing. The sound of keys dying in the air was the loudest thing in the room. She stood up, her face drained of color, and pointed at the monitor. The server logs were pinging our location. We hadn't stolen the ledger, we'd been gift-wrapped. Tessa didn't ask questions. She moved to the window and peeled back the heavy curtain an inch. A black sedan had just killed its engine at the end of the block. 2 men in tactical gear emerged, checking their weapons. We were already surrounded. I grabbed the ledger, my mind racing through the options. If we kept it, they had a target to follow. If we burned it, we had nothing to bargain with. I felt the sharp ache in my eyes as I tried to calculate our survival rate. The math was ugly, 4% survival if we fought, 12% if we surrendered. I realized then, Holloway wasn't here to retrieve his property. He was here to erase the people who had looked at the ledger at all. Tessa grabbed my arm. Her grip was iron. She told me to stop looking for a percentage that worked and start looking for an exit that existed. She was right. The math doesn't account for the bullet that misses. I heard the metal strike concrete. A boot. Outside. Then another. They weren't hiding anymore. The beacon had done its job. We were the pinned targets in a shooting gallery. Samira scrambled to the back wall, pulling away a false panel behind the records. It wasn't an exit, it was a utility crawl space. It wouldn't fit all of us. I looked at the ledger, then at the team. I knew what I had to do. The ledger didn't just track the money. It tracked the laundering path into offshore holdings. Whoever owned those holdings had the leverage over Holloway. I shoved the ledger into Tessa's bag, the one she used for deliveries. They'd look for the book, not a bag of rags. The door handle clicked. It wasn't locked, but it was weighted. I heard the breath of the man on the other side. My brain flickered. 2% chance of survival if we stayed, 5% if we broke right through them. I looked at Tessa. She had the iron pipe in her hand. The wood splintered. It wasn't a slow break, it was a detonation. The door flew inward, hitting the wall with a deafening crack. 2 silhouettes stood in the aperture, tactical lights blinding us. I didn't think. I kicked the desk, sending the lamp smashing into the floor, plunging us into total darkness. In the chaos, I heard the men yell. We had seconds before the darkness meant nothing. The door frame splintered inward with a crack that tasted like ozone and iron. I saw the muzzle flashes before I heard the shots. 3 men in tactical gear swarmed the threshold. I didn't see people. I saw threat vectors marked in flickering red decimals. My vision swum, the percentages jumping over the floorboards beneath their boots, 92%. The joists were rotted. I knew that from my architecture days, but I needed the math to be certain. I grabbed Tessa's jacket and pulled. I told him to jump on 3. My voice sounded thin, like glass rubbing against glass. I felt the heat of a bullet snapping past my ear, embedding into the plaster. I didn't flinch. I just waited for the numbers to align. They hit the floor. The wood groaned under the weight of the mercenaries. I saw the probability shift from 92 to 99, then 0. The boards disintegrated beneath the lead man's weight, swallowing him into the dark basement below. We hit the sewer floor, the stench of stagnant water filling our lungs. I didn't wait for them to stand. I pulled them into the pipe, the darkness swallowing us whole. Behind us, muffled shouts echoed down the hole. We stopped only when the ceiling lowered to the point of forcing us into a crouch. My vision had stopped strobing, but the headache behind my left eye was a physical weight now. I leaned against the mossy wall, breathing in the rot. Tessa checked the ledger, her hands steady despite the filth. She didn't say we were safe. She just looked at me, her eyes reflecting the dim light of Samira's cracked phone screen. She tapped the screen, highlighting a series of entries. It wasn't the usual wandering flow. It was a routing path to an offshore holding, disconnected from Holloway's public accounts. The signature was clean. Too clean. It was a digital fingerprint I hadn't seen before. I looked at the code. Holloway was playing a game, sure, but he wasn't the player. He was just the piece on the board. The offshore account was funding everything, including the team that just tried to kill us. Samira shifted in the dark, her eyes wide. She whispered that if we tracked the routing, we could find the source. For the first time in hours, the math wasn't about our survival. It was about retaliation. I looked at Tessa and Samira. They were covered in dust and sewer muck, but they were breathing. That was the only stat that mattered. I closed the ledger and slid it into my pocket. We weren't done yet. I turned back to the dark tunnel. The third party didn't know we were in the sewer. They didn't know we had the ledger. They had no idea I was about to recalculate their entire world. The motel room smelled of damp carpet and stale cigarette smoke. I spread the ledger across the stained bedspread. Tessa sat across from me, her brow furrowed, while Samira tapped at her laptop. We weren't just reading accounts. We were hunting ghosts. I squinted at the numbers. My left eye began to twitch, a familiar, sharp ache. The percentages flickered over the ledger, turning from gold to an angry, bleeding red. If I pushed this calculation to completion, I knew my vision would go dark. Tessa reached over and slid the ledger away from my hands. Her voice was firm, stripped of any pretense. She asked me if I was trying to go blind before we even hit the bank. I didn't have an answer that would keep her from taking the pen. I told her these ghost paintings were the only leverage we had. Holloway's loans were backed by canvases that didn't exist in any official catalog. If I didn't map these shell companies now, he'd liquidate them and vanish before the authorities could even blink. Samira looked up from her screen. She said she'd found the routing path. It didn't go to Holloway's accounts. It went to a private server in a tax haven, a chain that spanned 4 continents. Holloway was just a middleman, a glorified collector. The clarity hit us like a cold wave. We had the evidence of his dependency, not just his crimes. I could see the probability of his collapse now, mapped out in the data. He was losing his footing just as fast as I was losing my sight. I asked Samir to pull up the last transaction. It was dated for tomorrow, a total liquidation of the ghost assets. If we didn't act, the third party would strip Holloway dry, leaving us with nothing but a worthless ledger. I stood up to go to the bathroom, but my legs buckled. I caught myself on the doorframe, my reflection in the cheap mirror mocking me. Blood was leaking from the corner of my eye. My vision wasn't just failing, it was bleeding out. Tessa followed me. She saw the blood. She didn't say anything, she just pressed the damp washcloth against my face. Her hands were steady, grounded. She told me we had enough. I wanted to fight her, but for once, I couldn't find the argument. A low thud echoed from the hallway. Samira looked up, her face turning ashen. She checked the security feed on her phone. A man was walking down the hall, pausing at every door. It was Rourke. He was hunting. Rourke wasn't just guessing. The data beacon was working. I cursed myself for not scrubbing the ledger thoroughly enough. He was 5 doors down, then 3. I grabbed the encrypted drive, praying we still had an exit. A knock rattled the wood of our door. It was heavy, rhythmic, and perfectly polite. Rourke's voice drifted through the gap, sounding like oil on pavement. He asked if we were ready to settle our debt with Holloway. I didn't wait for him to kick the door in. I heard the handle turn, the scrape of metal on metal, and we were already out the bathroom window. I didn't look back at the room we'd just left. By sunrise, I was a ghost. I tried to call Henderson, the gallery owner who'd sold me my first lead. His phone rang 3 times before he picked up. I didn't even get to speak. He just told me he knew who I was, then dropped the line. Tessa threw the newspaper on the park bench between us. The headline was my face. It called me a career grifter, a parasite of the arts. They had buried me in print before I could even explain. Holloway was everywhere. Every email, every news cycle, every social feed. I watched from the safety of a library computer as he gave a press conference, talking about purifying the art world from predatory types like me. Then, the screen glitched. I saw it. A live auction link hidden behind a firewall. A ghost transaction scheduled in 20 minutes. The location? The one place I was told I was banned from. The address popped up in my vision. Not a warehouse, not a safe house. The central auction hall. It was the heart of his empire, and he was using it to finalize the very fraud I'd been hunting. Tessa didn't want to go. She grabbed my arm in the hallway, her face white. She knew if I walked in there, I wouldn't be walking back out. I didn't argue. I just pulled the gala invitation from my pocket, the one I'd swiped from Rourke weeks ago. I checked the probability of entry. 12%. Risky. But 12% was higher than 0. I caught a glimpse of Vincent Holloway in his office on the security feed. He looked satisfied, like a spider watching a fly struggle in a web he'd spun months ago. He had no idea I was coming for the weave. I stepped onto the auction floor. The air was cold, smelling of expensive cologne and desperation. I knew the security cameras were tracking my face. They weren't moving yet, but they were watching. Caught sight of the target, not a painting, but a man, a ghost broker meeting a courier near the service elevator, the exact transaction Holloway couldn't afford to have public. My vision glitched. The probability percentage for the courier's escape was 99. The probability for me stopping him was 3. I adjusted my posture and started the countdown. I wasn't there to stop him, I was there to record him. I stood in the service corridor, the smell of industrial cleaner stinging my lungs. Above, the auction house hummed with the sound of money moving from one corrupt pocket to another. I checked the watch. The anonymous bid was 5 minutes out. It had to be enough. I sent the bid from the terminal, 1 million over the base. The spike in the security logs wasn't a glitch, it was the reaction. Holloway's ego was a beautiful, predictable variable. I watched the flickering percentages on the nearby access panel. 92% chance he leaves his post. My vision glitched. A wave of gray static hit my retinas, sharp as a needle. I forced my breath to stay even. If I lost the sight now, the whole plan would collapse into a funeral. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 3, and opened them. The percentages were still there. The security door to the gallery floor hissed open. Holloway walked out, phone pressed to his ear, his face flushed with irritation. He didn't even glance my way. To him, I was just a ghost in a uniform. I slipped past the threshold the second the magnetic lock clicked. I navigated the hallways by the blueprints I'd memorized weeks ago. Every turn, every ventilation duct, every structural joist was a path I'd already walked in my head. I wasn't just a thief, I was an architect of this intrusion. The vault entrance wasn't locked with a simple key. It was a digital cipher linked to the painting's own frame. I approached the canvas, the fake, the Holloway used as an anchor for the shell companies. The percentage hovered over the signature, 12% real. I pulled the vial of chemical solvent from my pocket. It wasn't about theft, it was about erasure. I applied it to the corner, just enough to dissolve the synthetic layer and reveal the original layer underneath. My heart didn't race, it just waited for the math. The paint began to flake, revealing the mark of the true artist underneath, not Holloway's commission, a master's hand. He hadn't just faked the sale, he had been hiding the theft of this piece in plain sight for 3 years. The weight of the proof felt heavy. A soft click echoed in the hallway behind me. Not a door, a safety lock being disengaged on a sidearm. My percentages didn't even show a range. It was 0. I turned and there stood Rourke. He wasn't smiling anymore. He told me he'd figured out the lure too late, that I was a cockroach that didn't know when to die. His hand was shaking, just a fraction. He knew the cost of this failure better than I did. Holloway didn't forgive mistakes. I looked at him, really looked. I saw the probability of his next move, 5% chance he pulled the trigger here. 95% he wanted to drag me back to Holloway. He was afraid, and fear made people sloppy. He lunged, the weapon barrel swinging toward my chest. I didn't reach for him. I reached for the structural support I'd mapped out on the way in. The basement floor was rotten timber, not solid concrete. One shift in weight, and the game would reset again. The basement air tasted like rust and ozone. Rourke stood between me and the only exit, his loafers clicking on the concrete. He didn't look like a broker anymore. He looked like a man who knew his head was on the block. I blinked, trying to force the sight to trigger. A 42% flickered over his right shoulder, his lead hand, but the numbers dissolved into a smear of gray light. My vision was swimming. I couldn't calculate the math of this beating. Rourke didn't wait. He lunged, his fist catching my jaw before I could even register the movement. I slammed into a steel pipe. My head rang, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. He was right. I was a ghost. He reached for the ledger tucked under my arm. I didn't try to predict him. I just shoved the chemical solvent vial into his face and smashed it against the wall. The pungent, biting fumes filled the small space. He choked, clutching his eyes. I stumbled to the red handle of the fire suppression valve I'd spotted during my initial survey. It was the only way to clear the room and force the locks open. I grabbed it with both hands and turned. The roar of the fire suppression system deafened us. A deluge of white chemical foam erupted from the ceiling, blanketing the basement in seconds. Rourke was screaming, blind and disoriented in the snow-like spray. I didn't look back. I hit the service door, scrambled up the steel stairs, and didn't stop until I felt the cool air of the alleyway against my skin. The ledger was still in my pocket, heavy and mine. Tessa was at the door before I even knocked. She didn't hug me. She just pulled me inside, locked the bolts, and looked at my face, at the swelling, the blood, the shattered glasses in my pocket. She knew. I laid the ledger on the counter. Tessa didn't touch it. She was looking at the back wall, at the radio they used for monitoring police and secure channels. She picked up a screwdriver, her hand steady, and pried off the plastic casing. There it was, a tiny silver disc glowing with a faint pulsing light, taped to the circuit board, a transmitter. It wasn't just a listening device, it was a beacon. They hadn't just followed me. They'd been listening to every word we said. Tessa looked up at me. The silence in the shop was suddenly loud. Every secret we'd whispered, every strategy we'd planned, it hadn't been ours. We'd been giving our own execution orders to the people trying to kill us. The shop felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago. Every shadow was a threat. Tessa stood by the back shelves, the bug sitting between us on the table like a live bomb. I didn't want to look at her, but I had to. I asked her who she'd spoken to. Her hands were still, but her jaw tightened. She told me she hadn't talked to anyone outside this shop in 4 days. She looked at me like I was a stranger. Maybe I was. I turned to Samira next. She was the one who had handled the hardware last. She didn't argue. She just pulled up a diagnostic screen, her fingers moving in a blur. She pointed to a serial number etched into the casing. It wasn't a commercial bug. It was bespoke, military grade. Samira told me it was designed to piggyback on the shop's internal network, mirroring our traffic to Holloway servers. It wasn't a traitor in our ranks, it was the tech itself. The weight of the last 3 days finally started to lift. I looked at Tessa, then at Samira. I felt like an idiot. The probability was never them. The variables were external, hard-coded into the items we'd rescued from the auction house. Tessa didn't offer a hug or a lecture, she just handed me a glass of water. "Don't let it happen again," she said, her voice quiet. I didn't answer. I just drank the water until my throat burned. Samira was still working, dismantling the tracker piece by piece. She looked up and told me that if we fed the tracker a looping data feed, Holloway would think we were still sitting right here in the shop. Total invisibility. I saw the numbers then. A 94% chance of success for the feed. It was beautiful. For the first time since the alleyway, the path wasn't just a blind guess. It was a locked sequence. We had him. The moment I reached for the desk to steady myself, my vision flared white. A needle-sharp pain spiked behind my left eye. The physical cost of pushing the site too far. I clamped my hand over my face, hiding the reaction. I regained my focus. The numbers were still there, drifting, but I ignored the pain. We had a window. Holloway would be blind for 12 hours while the loop synced. 12 hours to hit his primary bank. Tessa walked over, standing beside me. She didn't look at the pain on my face. She didn't ask. She just looked at the map, tracing the route to Holloway's vault. We were done with the shadows. It was time for the strike. I walked to the front door and flipped the closed sign. The street outside was quiet. For the first time, I felt like the predator, not the prey. I was ready to take everything. The bank was a cathedral of cold marble and indifference. Holloway's money lived here, behind walls thicker than a man's conscience. I adjusted my borrowed tie, trying to ignore the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Today, we finally take back the balance. I approached the reception. My sight flickered. A 42% chance she'd ask for a secondary ID I didn't have. I needed to pivot the conversation before she could even reach for the phone. I looked her in the eye and didn't wait for her to speak. She bought it. The badge she handed me was thin, plastic, and heavy with opportunity. It felt like I'd just stolen the keys to a kingdom. I turned toward the elevator, keeping my gait steady. No rush. Rushing is a variable that triggers alarms. The compliance officer was waiting, a thin man with a gaze that dissected me like a specimen. I felt the sight spike at 12% survival rate if I didn't frame the audit perfectly. My brain throbbed. The numbers were bleeding together, turning into static. He leaned over the file. My vision was swimming, the percentages flickering like dying embers against his suit. "You're early, Rowie," he said. I didn't blink, I just stared at the ink on the page. "Efficiency is my only metric," I lied. He signed it. The stamp landed with a sound like a guillotine. He gestured toward the server room. The path was open. Every step I took felt like walking through water. My brain was burning, but the target was right there. The server room was an altar of humming steel. Thousands of blinking lights. Holloway's wealth wasn't gold, it was data. I plugged in the drive. The site surged, showing me the path into his deepest, most illegal architecture. The upload bar climbed, 40%, 60%. Then, the silence broke. A siren low, harsh, vibrating through the floorboards. The screen turned crimson. The bank didn't just notice the breach, it recognized my specific signature. The purge began. Every line of data I'd spent months tracing was evaporating. Holloway wasn't just hiding his secrets, he'd built a system that would rather die than be exposed. A heavy mechanical thud echoed through the room. I ran to the door and clawed at the panel, but the keypad was dead. I was locked in with a dying server. My head split open. A migraine so sharp I couldn't see my own hands. I was trapped. I closed my eyes, trying to force the site to give me one last out, one last probability calculation. But all I saw were columns of code falling like rain. The purge was faster than I was. What was I going to do now? Then, the terminal screen flickered again. A new file began to write itself onto the drive. It wasn't Holloway's data. It was an override. Someone else was in the system, and they were pulling the plug. Holloway had an enemy within. The steel door was sealed. No key, no card, no social bypass could open it now. Red light bathed the server racks, pulsing like a dying heart. Outside, I heard the boots guards coming to reclaim their secrets. The progress bar on the console crawled at a snail's pace, 92%. My fingers hovered over the manual override, but the encryption was a chaotic mess of rotating hex codes. I needed to see the sequence. I pushed my sight. I forced the percentages to manifest, overlaying the code with probability fields. The static in my brain spiked. It wasn't just numbers anymore, it was a cascade of white noise. Jagged line of blood traced down from my left tear duct. The pain wasn't a headache, it was a demolition. Every probability permutation I forced was costing me cells. My vision strobe lit into binary. They built this wall of numbers to protect the rod. They thought I'd hit the wall and stop. They didn't count on me being willing to burn the building down just to read the final page. The screen flickered. The encryption shattered. Data started pouring into the drive. I couldn't see the numbers clearly anymore, just shapes of gray light bleeding into the edges of the room. My eardrums popped. A ringing sound, sharp and persistent, drowned out the hum of the cooling fans. I reached out to pull the drive, but my hand felt like it belonged to someone else. The drive clicked out. I pulled it free. The weight of it was enough to tether me to reality for one more second. It was done. All of it. The ledger, the fraud, the provenance scams, all mine. But the room kept swaying. The floor didn't feel solid anymore. I tried to stand, but the logic, the probability maps, it all just vanished. My vision turned to absolute black. Not dimming, just gone. Silence. The humming of the servers, the clicking of the drive, everything disappeared. I was left in a dark, empty space. No numbers, no probabilities, just the heavy, terrifying silence of my own pulse. I felt a weightlessness that shouldn't have been there. My brain wasn't calculating anymore, it was just waiting. Was this the price? A full ledger for a permanent darkness? I didn't know. Then, footsteps. Heavy, metallic. They weren't just clicking anymore, they were rhythmic. Someone had finally cleared the door. I had the ledger, but I wasn't going to be the one who walked out of here. Tessa pried the locking mechanism open with a crowbar. Metal shrieked against metal. Behind the heavy door, Evan lay crumpled on the cold concrete. He didn't stir as the alarms hummed, his face pale and slack like a broken doll. Holloway stared at his terminal. The ledger was a ghost. Thousands of accounts, once teeming with wealth, now showed zero balances. His finger trembled as he refreshed the page. Nothing. Just the hollow void where his empire used to live. Samira took Evan's legs, her face set in a grim line. We moved through the corridors with the rhythmic thud of bank security boots echoing nearby. Tessa held her breath, guiding us toward the service stairwell. We were ghosts, hoping we stayed unseen. Holloway paced his boardroom. He grabbed his assistant by the collar, throwing him against the wall. He needed a culprit, and he needed one now. He didn't care who it was, as long as he had a name to blame for the ruin. The alley door swung open. Cold air hit us. The van was waiting, engine idling. Samira shoved the back door wide, and we heaved Evan into the darkness of the cargo hold. I just hoped his heart was still beating. Holloway threw a paperweight through his office window. Glass rained down onto the street below. He had spent his whole life building a wall of reputation, and now it was dissolving like salt in a storm. He picked up his phone, ready to burn it all down. Safe house. The room smelled of old paper and ozone. I felt a hand on my brow. My eyes snapped open, but everything was just a thick, suffocating gray. I blinked, expecting the percentages, the numbers, nothing. Only shadows. I pushed myself up, my head feeling like it had been split by a wedge. I focused on Tessa, expecting the numbers to flicker, to tell me if she was lying. But the air was clear, sterile, dead. I asked her if the light was on. Tessa went silent, her face, her heartbeat. I couldn't read a single variable. No numbers, no odds, just the terrifying, raw human experience I'd forgotten how to handle. I was blind. Holloway sat in his dark office, surrounded by dossiers of everyone he'd ever employed. One by one, he crossed their names out with a heavy fountain pen. He didn't know who did it, so he decided to break them all until someone confessed. Tessa didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat there waiting. She knew. She had seen me pushing until I broke. Samira stood by the door, her hands clenching her utility jacket, looking at me with eyes full of pity. I hated that look. I reached out, grabbing a cup from the side table. My hand missed it entirely. It shattered against the floor. I didn't see the shards. I didn't see the probability of me cutting myself. I didn't see anything. Just darkness. darkness was total. I tried to lift my head, but the effort sent a spike of white-hot pain through my eyes. I reached out. Empty air. The sight that flickering, sterile math, it was gone. Just a void behind my lids. Tessa's hand caught my wrist. She didn't say a word, just squeezed. I could smell the ozone of her cleaning supplies and the stale air of the hideout. I wasn't alone, but I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. How do you fight a god if you can't even see the board? I told her that the percentages were the only reason I was even in this room. Tessa looked back. She said I wasn't a computer. I was an architect. She placed a cold piece of metal in my palm. An antique silver platter. I traced the grain, the weight, the balance. Suddenly, my mind didn't see numbers, it saw the room. The layout, the architecture of our escape, it was enough. I realized Holloway didn't win because he had the best odds. He won because he created the environment that forced others to lose. I didn't need to see the math anymore. I needed to build a new architecture, a social one. Samira brought in the drive. I couldn't see the files, but I told her exactly which folders to read. She sounded surprised. I'd never relied on anyone else's eyes before. I asked her for the human names, not the data. In my head, I painted Holloway. He was cleaning his office right now, I was sure of it. He was purging his staff, destroying names to hide his tracks. He was so terrified of the leak, he was killing his own foundation. He was purging, the remaining assets were trapped in fear. I gave Samira the names. If we hit the secondary auditors now, the social collapse would start. He wouldn't just lose money, he'd lose his allies. The weight of the ledger in my lap felt like a coffin. I was blind, but I knew exactly where to bury him. Tessa touched my shoulder. I told her I was ready to end it no matter the cost. The phone on the table rang. It was a burner, the one we kept for Knox. It sounded like a scream in the quiet room. Tessa picked it up. She looked at me. It was time. Knox's voice was gravel on the other end. He'd seen the files Samira dumped. He didn't ask questions. He asked if I was ready to bring the whole house down on Holloway's head. I didn't smile. I didn't feel the math. I just said yes. The ledger was theirs now, and the trap was set. Holloway had no idea, but the game was already over. My phone buzzed against the table. I didn't need to see the screen. It was Knox. He'd finally found a reason to burn the ledger to the ground. I traced the edge of the device, the weight of it feeling like a death warrant. I picked it up. Knox didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told me the district attorney was blocking the warrant. Holloway had reached too high. I told him we didn't need the law, we needed a structural collapse. Tessa was watching. I heard her breath hitching every time I mentioned the gallery's HVAC blueprints. She didn't want a mission, she wanted me alive. I told her the gallery wasn't a fortress. It was a construction project I'd already mastered. I needed to see the building. Not with my eyes, but with the architectural memory I'd spent 4 years sharpening. I described the load-bearing columns. The ventilation shafts were narrow, sure, but they shared a common spine with the primary exhaust. Tessa didn't understand the physics of it. She pointed at the diagrams, her fingers tracing the path I'd mapped out. She whispered that the path was suicidal. I corrected her. It wasn't suicide if you knew exactly where the floor would hold you. I asked Samira to pull the city's original permit files, not the ones Holloway had filed, the originals from the 1970s, the ones that hadn't been digitized yet. If the structure had a weakness, it was written in the mortar. The files were rotting, but the data was clear. I felt the paper texture, the indentations of a stamp that didn't match the standard gallery design. It was a change order, a late-stage adjustment to the blueprints hidden behind a false floor. Tessa read the specs aloud. She said it made no sense. Why would an architect reinforce the ventilation spine in a public gallery? I realized the truth then. It wasn't about airflow, it was about soundproofing. Holloway was hiding something in the walls. I told Tessa to look for a room without windows. Not a secure vault, but a ghost space. Something the city never audited. She searched the old property lines for 10 minutes. Then, she stopped talking. She whispered that the blueprints were fake. The entire east wing of the gallery was wider than the floor plan. She said there was a vault in the blueprints that didn't appear in the tax records, a ghost vault. My pulse raced. I didn't need the percentages to see the win. If Holloway was hiding the provenance, the ledger wasn't just evidence. It was the skeleton key to the entire gallery. I smiled, feeling the structure of the trap falling into place. Tessa asked if I was sure about the vault. I reached out, tracing the invisible geometry of the room I hadn't yet stepped in. It didn't matter if it was real, it was a vulnerability, and Holloway had no idea I was already inside the blueprints. The darkness wasn't the worst part, it was the silence. I stood in the safe house, tracing the edge of the blueprint with my thumb. Holloway's ghost vault wasn't just a fantasy anymore. It was a physical coordinate, and I was going to walk straight into the belly of the beast. Tessa spoke from the doorway. She didn't like it. I heard her shift her weight, the fabric of her apron rustling against the door frame. She told me I was walking into a morgue, not an auction. I didn't blame her. I couldn't even see the exit, let alone defend myself. I told her the goal wasn't to fight, it was to be invited. To get into Holloway's inner circle, I needed an advocate, someone powerful enough to make Holloway blink, but vain enough to believe he was using me. I had a name, Sterling. He was the only shark in this pond with bigger teeth than Holloway. Sterling's private viewing room smelled of old wax and expensive cologne. He stood by a 17th century landscape, his hand on his chin. He asked me what I saw. I didn't need the sight to know the canvas had been restretched. I told him the weave was too perfect for the era. His hand froze. "Aye," Sterling laughed, a brittle sound that lacked humor. He asked how I knew. I explained the chemistry of the pigment. He looked at the painting again, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't looking at art anymore. He was looking at an investment that had just turned into a liability. He was hooked. He turned to me. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, hungry curiosity. He wanted to know how many more of his treasures were trash. I told him all of them. He didn't fire me. He pulled out an invitation to the Holloway Charity Gala. He told me I was coming. Back at the shop, I told Tessa the news. She didn't celebrate. She started checking the tracker on my coat again. She asked if I was sure I could play the part. I didn't tell her that without my eyes. I had to memorize every square inch of the gala layout. I just smiled. The night of the gala was a symphony of footsteps and muffled whispers. Sterling gripped my arm too hard, introducing me as his secret weapon. I felt the temperature drop when we walked in. The air in Holloway's hall was thick with the scent of lilies and rot. I counted the steps to the central hall. Sterling kept bragging, loud enough for Holloway to hear. He wanted to humiliate his rival. I didn't care. I kept my head down, listening to the echoes. I heard Holloway's voice before I saw him, that smooth, practiced tone that hit 100 bodies. He was close. Sterling made the introduction. He boasted about my gift. Holloway didn't interrupt. He just stood there. I couldn't see his face, but I could hear the change in his breathing. He knew who I was. He hadn't forgotten the alley. He hadn't forgotten the $12. Holloway leaned in. He whispered that I looked lost. He told me that some guests weren't meant to be here. I didn't back down. I told him the architecture was fascinating, especially the parts that didn't appear on the blueprints. His smile vanished. I had his attention now. He walked away then, but the damage was done. He knew I was a threat. As I stood in the middle of that room, surrounded by people who couldn't see past my clothes, I felt it. The ghosts were still with me, and tonight I was going to set them free. The gala was a wall of sound-clinking crystal, forced laughter, the static of expensive perfumes. Holloway was watching. I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure against my shoulder. He knew. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was a leak in his perfect dam. I didn't need eyes to see the pattern. Samir's data had highlighted the weak points, the donors who felt underappreciated by Holloway. I moved through the crowd, my boots silent on the marble, brushing against the glass of champagne held by Sterling's closest rival. The shift was immediate. The donor pulled away, clutching his lapel. He didn't look at Holloway when the mogul walked by. One seed planted, then another. The social architecture was collapsing, one ignored greeting at a time. Holloway noticed. I could smell the ozone of his expensive cologne shift as he moved through the room, his stride becoming sharp and aggressive. He wasn't looking for a drink, he was looking for the architect of his ruin. His head of security stepped into my path, a wall of muscle and cheap cologne. He didn't know who I was, just that I didn't fit the cut of the fabric here. He stepped into my personal space, his chest expanding as he tried to intimidate me. I didn't blink. I told him his tie was crooked, just a distraction, a ripple in the pond. As he looked down, embarrassed, I slipped past him into the shadow of the velvet curtains. A simple trick, a basic failure of focus. I felt a hand grab my collar before I could reach the stairwell, a firm, manic grip that didn't belong to the guard. It was Holloway. His breath was shallow, his voice a low, jagged rasp against my ear. He told me he'd see me whispering to his donors. He thought I was selling out his secrets for a pittance. He had no idea I was the one who had written those secrets into the ledger of his failures. I smiled. Not a big one, just enough to let him know I was enjoying the panic. I told him he was late, that the auction was already over, in every way that mattered. He shoved me back, his eyes wild. He opened a door with a heavy brass key, the study. He dragged me inside, a small, soundproofed room lined with books nobody ever read. The door slammed shut. The latch clicked. We were alone. The sounds of the gala muffled into nothingness. He turned to me, breathing hard. The mask of the billionaire finally completely cracked. He wanted to know how I did it. I wanted to show him why it was already too late. He lunged at me, his fingers reaching for my throat. I didn't move. I'd mapped this room 3 days ago, and I knew exactly what was waiting behind that door. The start of everything I'd planned. The lock clicked, a sound as heavy as a coffin lid. Holloway didn't just bring me here to talk. He was pacing the floor, the click of his shoes steady, deliberate. He knew who I was. He knew what I had become. He laid it all out. Every theft, every lie. He even mentioned the hit and run, my debt, the way my brain stuttered under the weight of the probability percentages. He'd been watching the variables too, and he saw mine hitting 0. Walk away, he said. Leave the city. Be a ghost, or he'd have me committed. A delusional architecture dropout with a record of grand larceny. Who would believe a blind man? He held the cards now. He held the whole deck. You eat. I didn't answer. Instead, I forced my mind to work, just once more. I needed to predict his next step. My brain felt like a dry engine, grinding against rust. If I could just see the percentage, I could move. My vision flared, not with data, but with white, agonizing fire. The migraine hit like a physical weight, dropping me to my knees. The air turned thin. My sight wasn't coming back. It was breaking for good. I couldn't breathe, but I had one move left. My hand slipped into my pocket. My fingers touched the drive. The upload trigger. If I could get to the terminal, I could send it all to the public server. I reached out. The door swung open before I could stand. Security. Men in suits, heavy shoulders, faces I knew from 100 gallery feeds. Holloway didn't move, he just smiled. He wanted me to see it. He wanted me to know I had failed. They grabbed me. I fought, but I was nothing, a blind man against a professional. Every punch they threw, I didn't see coming. I only felt the impact. The floor became my entire world. My fingers scraped the desk corner. I found it. I hit the enter key. The upload light turned green. It was sending. It didn't matter what they did to me now. The truth was out. The guard noticed. He grabbed my wrist, twisting until I heard the bone crack. I screamed, but it didn't stop them. They dragged me back. I was fading, the room spinning into black. They threw me into the dark. I hit Coldstone, the ghost vault. I couldn't move my legs. I could hear the muffled sound of Holloway's voice outside giving orders. He was sealing it. Then, the smell hit me. Gasoline. Poured right under the door. He wasn't just hiding me. He was erasing the vault, the ledger, and me. The match was waiting. I was going to burn for his sins. The air was thick, heavy with the sharp chemical bite of gasoline. I didn't reach for my sight. It was gone. Instead, I reached for memory. I mapped the wall in my mind, remembering the blueprint lines I'd studied months ago. The HVAC duct wasn't supposed to be here. It was a structural shortcut. My fingers found the weak spot. The mounting bracket was rusted, a flaw in the original design. I pulled. Once, then twice. The metal groaned, yielding just enough for me to force the grate inward. The smell of the corridor hit me. It was cold. That meant airflow. Water began to spray from the ceiling. A deep, heavy rumble echoed through the building. The fire had started. I dragged my broken body through the narrow gap into the duct, feeling the metal bite into my ribs. The heat was already finding me. I didn't need eyes. I heard the hum of the cooling fans and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the elevator gears. I climbed. My hands were shredded, but the path was clear downward toward the central axis of the building. The fire was an advantage now. It forced the security teams out of the corridors. Holloway stood on the gallery floor, staring up at the smoke rising in the distance. He had a glass of wine in his hand. He wasn't worried. He was waiting for the final report that I was ashes. He'd never been more wrong. I stepped out of the maintenance hatch behind the stage. The heat was blistering. My clothes were soaked in soot and water. I couldn't see the crowd, but I could hear them. Hundreds of voices, breathless, waiting for the final sale. I didn't care about the pain anymore. I walked forward. The light at the stage was blinding, even through my darkness. I felt the edge of the wooden platform under my boots. I stopped. The murmuring stopped with me. The room turned ice cold. Holloway didn't look scared. He looked confused. He adjusted his tie, his hand shaking just a fraction. He stepped toward the light, trying to see if I was a ghost or a man. I held up the ledger fragment. I couldn't see the faces in the audience, but I could hear them. Whispers. 100 people realizing that the man who owned their world was a fraud. Holloway's face went white. The gamble was over. It was time for the final count. My vision flickered one last time, not with numbers, but with darkness. The pain in my head reached a crescendo, a final warning that I was breaking. But as I listened to the murmurs turning into shouts, I knew one thing. I had won. Holloway reached for his collar, trying to shout, but no words came out. The people in the room were rising. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at me. They were looking at the truth I had bled for. I leaned against the podium, the cold wood keeping me upright. Holloway was finished. I didn't need to see the success rate. I knew the math of justice. It was a perfect, final calculation. The stage lights were searing, even through my darkness. I heard the collective gasp of 100 wealthy patrons, the soft rustle of silk and expensive wool stiffening. I wasn't just a man on stage, I was a ghost walking out of the fire. Holloway's voice cut through the silence. It wasn't loud, but it dripped with a terrifying, practiced calm. He asked how a dead man had found the strength to walk, and his own security team shifted their weight, unsure whether to drag me off or stand their ground. I didn't need to look at him. I could smell the ozone from the fire still on my clothes, clashing with the expensive cologne radiating off his suit. I slapped the heavy ledger onto the mahogany lectern. The thud was the only sound in the room. I told the room this was his real masterpiece. Not the paintings on the wall, the numbers. The way he moved millions through shell corporations and dead artists' estates. Every name in this book was someone they knew. A ripple of murmurs started in the front rows. People were opening their own phones, checking digital portfolios. Holloway tried to shout me down, calling me a vagrant, but his voice cracked. The authority was draining out of him, replaced by a frantic, sweating panic. I named the specific account he used for the 2021 London auction. The room went dead silent again. Someone in the front, a man who had funded half of Holloway's portfolio, slowly stood up, his face ashen. He realized his money wasn't in art. It was gone. Holloway lunged at me. He wasn't the sophisticated dealer anymore. He was a cornered animal, tie loosened, eyes wide with the raw, ugly realization that his empire was turning into dust. He grabbed my collar, but his hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold me. He never got to hit me. A heavy hand slammed into his shoulder, dragging him back. It was his own lead investor. He looked at Holloway with the kind of disdain usually reserved for a broken, useless thing. I just stood there, listening to the empire crumble. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. The adrenaline was failing, the darkness behind my eyes becoming total. I didn't care. I could hear them calling the authorities. I could hear Holloway screaming that he was still the one in charge. He was losing it. The man who owned this city was being held down like a common thief by the people he used to look down on. He shouted at them to stop, but the look in their eyes was colder than mine had ever been. He was a liability now. A net negative in their ledgers. I closed my eyes. The calculation was done. The math of my life had always been rigged, but for 1 second, the equation balanced perfectly. He was down, and I was still standing, even if I couldn't see the finish line. Holloway bucked like a cornered animal, but the hands gripping his shoulders were too strong. These were his former donors. They weren't protecting him, they were pinning him down to save their own skins. The heavy brass doors of the gallery groaned open. Detective Knox didn't need to shout. He just walked into the room, his eyes scanning the chaos like he was counting the pieces of a wreck. Knox looked at me, then at the ledger I held. The paper was soaked in sweat and something darker, but he knew exactly what he was looking at. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Holloway stopped fighting. He watched Knox pull the handcuffs from his belt. The mogul's face, once polished and perfect, just melted into something old and hollow. The click of the cuffs was the loudest sound in the room. It wasn't a mechanical noise. It was the sound of a century of theft being locked away. My eyes stayed closed. I didn't need to see the percentages anymore. Tessa caught me before I hit the ground. She didn't say anything, but her grip on my arm was steady. It was the first time I felt real weight beneath my feet in months. I looked up at the ceiling. The vaulted glass seemed impossibly far away. For months, this entire building had been a machine, a math equation designed to kill me. Now, it was just steel and wood. My brain was quiet. The flickering numbers, the percentages that haunted every choice, they were gone. Just darkness, not the bad kind. Just silence. I felt human again. The next morning, the offer arrived in a crisp envelope. A top-tier firm, architects. They wanted my genius. They wanted the math. They didn't know the cost of the calculation. Tessa was in the back, sorting through a box of rusted clockwork parts. She didn't look up, but she knew I was standing there. She held up a small, broken gear, smiling without turning. The envelope was paper. The shop was real. I looked at the offer again, then back at the shop wall, where every object had a history that no calculation could ever explain. I didn't need the firm. I didn't need the percentages. I walked toward the counter, tossed the letter in the bin, and started helping her sort. I was finally just a man in a shop. The morning air in the shop smelled like cedar and old paper. It was quiet. No sirens, no gala music, just the steady sound of a broom sweeping across the floorboards. I was finally here, and it didn't feel like a setup. Tessa was in the back, sorting through a pile of silver plates. She didn't look up, but she knew I was watching. She said she'd never seen me just stand still before. I told her I was getting used to it. She handed me a tarnished bronze statuette. For a second, my eyes flickered, looking for the percentage overlay, looking for the angle to flip it. But there was nothing, just the weight of the metal and the craftsmanship. I set it on the table. It was beautiful. I asked her if she still wanted a partner, a real one. She looked at me, not like a business prospect, but like someone who had been through the same trenches. She reached out and placed the ledger in front of me. She said we were already partners. We'd just been too busy surviving to sign the paperwork. My vision swirled for a heartbeat, the old reflex. I stared at a crack in the floor, and for a split second, I saw 42%. The old ghost of my condition. My pulse spiked. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. Not here. Not again. I took a slow breath. I forced my eyes to focus on the grain of the wood instead of the numbers that weren't there. I blinked. The overlay faded to gray, then nothing. I was still here. It was just a floor, just a crack in the wood. I let go. Tess asked if I was all right. She'd seen that look before. I shook my head, kept it simple. I told her I was just thinking about how much I'd missed this. The quiet, the work that didn't require a death count to justify. Samira called out from the back, her voice echoing through the stacks of old records. She'd been tracking the city's response to the Holloway trial. It was a mess. The elite were scrambling, trying to erase their names from every ledger they could find. I didn't care. Let them burn their own houses down. I walked over to the window, watching the rain start to fall against the glass. It wasn't the kind of storm that chased me anymore. It was just weather. I had a shop. I had a partner who knew exactly who I was and hadn't run away. I had everything. The shop bell chimed, sharp, clear, and unexpected. It wasn't a collector, and it wasn't a lawyer. A stranger stood in the doorway, shaking an umbrella, looking for something real in a city that had spent months selling lies. He looked up, meeting my eyes. He was lost, I could tell. He wanted to know the history of a piece his father had left behind. Something authentic. Something the auctions didn't want. I smiled. I didn't reach for the math. I didn't search for a percentage. I just pulled out my loupe and reached for the object. Finally, for the first time, I was just a man in a shop, helping someone find the truth. And that was enough.